Master Humphrey's Clock, Section 6. This recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock, Chapter 4. The Clock. As we were going upstairs, Mr. Pickwick put on his spectacles, which he had held in his hand hitherto, arranged his neckerchief, smoothed down his waistcoat, and made many other little preparations of that kind which men are accustomed to be mindful of when they are going among strangers for the first time, and are anxious to impress them pleasantly. Seeing that I smiled, he smiled too, and said that if it had occurred to him before he left home, he would certainly have presented himself in pumps and silk stockings. 'I would indeed, my dear sir,' he said very seriously. 'I would have shown my respect for the society by laying aside my gaiters.' 'You may rest assured,' said I, 'that they would have regretted your doing so, very much, for they are quite attached to them.' 'No, really!' cried Mr. Pickwick with manifest pleasure. 'Do you think they care about my gaiters? Do you seriously think that they identify me at all with my gaiters?' 'I am sure they do,' I replied. 'Well now,' said Mr. Pickwick, 'that is one of the most charming and agreeable circumstances that could possibly have occurred to me.' I should not have written down this short conversation, but that it developed a slight point in Mr. Pickwick's character with which I was not previously acquainted. He had a secret pride in his legs. The manner in which he spoke, and the accompanying glance he bestowed upon his tights, convinced me that Mr. Pickwick regards his legs with much innocent vanity. 'But here are our friends,' said I, opening the door and taking his arm in mine. 'Let them speak for themselves. Gentlemen, I present to you Mr. Pickwick.' Mr. Pickwick and I must have been a good contrast just then. I, leaning quietly on my crutch stick with something of a careworn patient air; he having hold of my arm, and bowing in every direction with the most elastic politeness, and an expression of face whose sprightly cheerfulness and good humour knew no bounds. The difference between us must have been more striking yet, as we advanced towards the table, and the amiable gentleman, accepting his jocund step to my poor tread, had his attention divided between treating my infirmities with the utmost consideration, and affecting to be wholly unconscious that I required any. I made him personally known to each of my friends in turn. First to the deaf gentleman, whom he regarded with much interest, and accosted with great frankness and cordiality. He had evidently some vague idea at the moment that my friend being deaf must be dumb also, for when the latter opened his lips to express the pleasure it afforded him to know a gentleman of whom he had heard so much, Mr. Pickwick was so extremely disconcerted that I was obliged to step in to his relief. His meeting with Jack Redburn was quite a treat to see. Mr. Pickwick smiled, and shook hands, and looked at him through his spectacles, and under them, and over them, and nodded his head approvingly, and then nodded to me, as much as to say, 'This is just the man, you were quite right,' and then turned to Jack and said a few hearty words, and then did and said everything over again with unimpaired vivacity. As to Jack himself, he was quite as much delighted with Mr. Pickwick as Mr. Pickwick could possibly be with him. Two people never can have met together since the world began, who exchanged a warmer or more enthusiastic greeting. It was amusing to observe the difference between this encounter and that which succeeded between Mr. Pickwick and Mr. Miles. It was clear that the latter gentleman viewed our new member as a kind of rival in the affections of Jack Redburn, and besides this he had more than once hinted to me in secret that although he had no doubt Mr. Pickwick was a very worthy man, still he did consider that some of his exploits were unbecoming a gentleman of his years and gravity. Over and above these grounds of distrust, it is one of his fixed opinions that the law never can by possibility do anything wrong. He therefore looks upon Mr. Pickwick as one who has justly suffered in purse and peace for a breach of his plighted faith to an unprotected female, and holds that he is called upon to regard him with some suspicion on that account. These causes led to a rather cold and formal reception, which Mr. Pickwick acknowledged with the same stateliness and intense politeness as was displayed on the other side. Indeed, he assumed an air of such majestic defiance, that I was fearful he might break out into some solemn protest or declaration, and therefore inducted him into his chair without a moment's delay. This piece of generalship was perfectly successful. The instant he took his seat, Mr. Pickwick surveyed us all with a most benevolent aspect, and was taken with a fit of smiling full 5 minutes long. His interest in our ceremonies was immense. They are not very numerous or complicated, and a description of them may be comprised in very few words. As our transactions have already been, and must necessarily continue to be more or less anticipated by being presented in these pages at different times and under different forms, they do not require a detailed account. Our first proceeding when we are assembled is to shake hands all round and greet each other with cheerful and pleasant looks. Remembering that we assemble not only for the promotion of our happiness, but with the view of adding something to the common stock, an air of languor or indifference in any member of our body would be regarded by the others as a kind of treason. We have never had an offender in this respect, but if we had, there is no doubt that he would be taken to task pretty severely. Our salutation over, the venerable piece of antiquity from which we take our name is wound up in silence. The ceremony is always performed by Master Humphrey himself. In treating of the club, I may be permitted to assume the historical style and speak of myself in the third person, who mounts upon a chair for the purpose, armed with a large key. While it is in progress, Jack Redburn is required to keep at the farther end of the room under the guardianship of Mr. Miles, for he is known to entertain certain aspiring and unhallowed thoughts connected with the clock, and has even gone so far as to state that if he might take the works out for a day or two, he thinks he could improve them. We pardon him his presumption in consideration of his good intentions, and his keeping this respectful distance, which last penalty is insisted on, lest by secretly wounding the object of our regard in some tender part, in the ardour of his zeal for its improvement, he should fill us with dismay and consternation. This regulation afforded Mr. Pickwick the highest delight, and seemed, if possible, to exalt Jack in his good opinion. The next ceremony is the opening of the clock case, of which Master Humphrey has likewise the key, the taking from it as many papers as will furnish forth our evening's entertainment, and arranging in the recess some new contributions as have been provided since our last meeting. This is always done with peculiar solemnity. The deaf gentleman then fills and lights his pipe, and we once more take our seats round the table before mentioned, Master Humphrey acting as president, if we can be said to have any president where all are on the same social footing, and our friend Jack as secretary. Our preliminaries being now concluded, we fall into any train of conversation that happens to suggest itself, or proceed immediately to one of our readings. In the latter case, the paper selected is consigned to Master Humphrey, who flattens it carefully on the table and makes dog's ears in the corner of every page, ready for turning over easily. Jack Redburn trims the lamp with a small machine of his own invention which usually puts it out. Mr. Miles looks on with great approval notwithstanding. The deaf gentleman draws in his chair so that he can follow the words on the paper, or on Master Humphrey's lips as he pleases, and Master Humphrey himself, looking round with mighty gratification, glancing up at his old clock, begins to read aloud. Mr. Pickwick's face, while his tale was being read, would have attracted the attention of the dullest man alive. The complacent motion of his head and forefinger as he gently beat time, and corrected the air with imaginary punctuation, the smile that mantled on his features at every jocose passage, and the sly look he stole around to observe its effect, the calm manner in which he shut his eyes and listened when there was some little piece of description, the changing expression with which he acted the dialogue to himself, the agony that the deaf gentleman should know what it was all about, and his extraordinary anxiety to correct the reader when he hesitated at a word in the manuscript, or substituted a wrong one, were alike worthy of remark. And when at last, endeavouring to communicate with the deaf gentleman by means of the finger alphabet, with which he constructed such words as are unknown in any civilized or savage language, he took up a slate and wrote in large text, one word in a line, the question, "How do you like it?" When he did this, and handing it over the table awaited the reply, with a countenance only brightened and improved by his great excitement, even Mr. Miles relaxed, and could not forbear looking at him for the moment with interest and favour. "It has occurred to me," said the deaf gentleman, who had watched Mr. Pickwick and everybody else with silent satisfaction, 'It has occurred to me,' said the deaf gentleman, taking his pipe from his lips, 'that now is our time for filling our only empty chair.' As our conversation had naturally turned upon the vacant seat, we lent a willing ear to this remark, and looked at our friend inquiringly. 'I feel sure,' said he, 'that Mr. Pickwick must be acquainted with somebody who would be an acquisition to us; that he must know the man we want. Pray let us not lose any time, but set this question at rest. Is it so, Mr. Pickwick?' The gentleman addressed was about to return a verbal reply, but remembering our friend's infirmity, he substituted for this kind of answer some 50 nods. Then taking up the slate and printing on it a gigantic Yes, he handed it across the table, and rubbing his hands as he looked round upon our faces, protested that he and the deaf gentleman quite understood each other already. 'The person I have in mind,' said Mr. Pickwick, 'and whom I should not have presumed to mention to you until some time hence, but for the opportunity you have given me, is a very strange old man. His name is Bamber.' 'Bamber!' said Jack. 'I have certainly heard the name before.' 'I have no doubt then,' said Mr. Pickwick, 'that you remember him in those adventures of mine the posthumous papers of our old club, I mean although he is only incidentally mentioned, and, if I remember right, appears but once.' 'That's it,' said Jack. 'Let me see. He is the person who has a grave interest in old mouldy chambers and the Inns of Court, and who relates some anecdotes having reference to his favourite theme, and an odd ghost story. Is that the man?' 'The very same. Now,' said Mr. Pickwick, lowering his voice to a mysterious and confidential tone, 'he is a very extraordinary and remarkable person, living and talking and looking like some strange spirit whose delight is to haunt old buildings, and absorbed in that one subject which you have just mentioned to an extent which is quite wonderful. When I retired into private life I sought him out, and I do assure you that the more I see of him, the more strongly I am impressed with the strange and dreamy character of his mind.' 'Where does he live?' I inquired. 'He lives,' said Mr. Pickwick, 'in one of those dull, lonely old places with which his thoughts and stories are all connected, quite alone, and often shut up close for several weeks together. In this dusty solitude he broods upon the fancies he has so long indulged, and when he goes into the world, or anybody from the world without goes to see him, they are still present to his mind and still his favourite topic. I may say, I believe, that he has brought himself to entertain a regard for me, and an interest in my visits, feeling which I am certain he would extend to Master Humphrey's clock if he were once tempted to join us. All I wish you to understand is, that he is a strange secluded visionary, in the world but not of it, and as unlike anybody here as he is unlike everybody elsewhere that I have ever met or known.' Mr. Miles received this account of our proposed companion with rather a wry face, and after murmuring that perhaps he was a little mad, inquired if he were rich. 'I never asked him,' said Mr. Pickwick. 'You might know, sir, for all that,' retorted Mr. Miles sharply. 'Perhaps so, sir,' said Mr. Pickwick, no less sharply than the other, 'but I do not. Indeed,' he added, relapsing into his usual mildness, 'I have no means of judging. He lives poorly, but that would seem to be in keeping with his character. I never heard him allude to his circumstances, and never fell into the society of any man who had the slightest acquaintance with them. I have really told you all I know about him, and it rests with you to say whether you wish to know more, or know quite enough already.' We were unanimously of opinion that we would seek to know more, and as a sort of compromise with Mr. Miles, who, although he said yes, oh certainly, he should like to know more about the gentleman, he had no right to put himself in opposition to the general wish, and so forth, shook his head doubtfully and hemmed several times with peculiar gravity. It was arranged that Mr. Pickwick should carry me with him on an evening visit to the subject of our discussion, for which purpose an early appointment between that gentleman and myself was immediately agreed upon, it being understood that I was to act upon my own responsibility, and to invite him to join us or not, as I might think proper. This solemn question determined, we returned to the clock case, where we have been forestalled by the reader, and between its contents and the conversation they occasioned, the remainder of our time passed very quickly. When we broke up, Mr. Pickwick took me aside to tell me that he had spent a most charming and delightful evening. Having made this communication with an air of the strictest secrecy, he took Jack Redburn into another corner to tell him the same, and then retired into another corner with the deaf gentleman and the slate, to repeat the assurance. It was amusing to observe the contest in his mind whether he should extend his confidence to Mr. Miles, or treat him with dignified reserve. Half a dozen times he stepped up behind him with a friendly air, and as often stepped back again without saying a word. At last, when he was close at that gentleman's ear and upon the very point of whispering something conciliating and agreeable, Mr. Miles happened suddenly to turn his head, upon which Mr. Pickwick skipped away, and said, with some fierceness, 'Good night, sir. I was about to say good night, sir. Nothing more,' and so made a bow and left him. 'Now, Sam,' said Mr. Pickwick, when he had got downstairs. 'All right, sir,' replied Mr. Weller. 'Hold hard, sir. Right arm first. Now the left. Now one strong conwulsion, and the greatcoat's on, sir.' Mr. Pickwick acted upon these directions, and being further assisted by Sam, who pulled at one side of the collar, and Mr. Weller, who pulled hard at the other side, was speedily enrobed. Mr. Weller senior then produced a full-sized stable lantern, which he had carefully deposited in a remote corner on his arrival, and inquired whether Mr. Pickwick would have the lamps alight. 'I think not to night,' said Mr. Pickwick. 'Then if this here lady vill permit,' rejoined Mr. Weller, 'we'll leave it here, ready for next journey. This here lantern, mum,' said Mr. Weller, handing it to the housekeeper, 'vunce belonged to the celebrated Bill Blinder as is now at grass, as all on us vill be in our turns. Bill, mum, was the hostler, and had charge of them two well known piebald letters that run in the Bristol fast coach, and vould never go to no other tune but a southerly vind and a cloudy sky, which was consequently played incessantly by the guard whenever they wos on duty. He was took wery bad one arternoon, and having been off his feed and wery shaky on his legs for some veeks, and he says to his mate, "Matey," he says, "I think I'm a going the wrong side of the post, and that my foot's wery near the bucket. Don't say I ain't," he says, "for I know I am, and don't let me be interrupted," he says, "for I've saved a little money, and I'm a going into the stable to make my last vill and testymint. I'll take care as nobody interrupts," says his mate, "but you only hold up your head and shake your ears a bit, and you're good for 20 years to come." Bill Blinder makes him no answer, but he goes avay into the stable, and there he soon aftervards lays himself down atween the two piebalds, and dies, previously a writing outside on the corn chest, "This is the last vill and testymint of Villiam Blinder." They was naturally wery much amazed by this, and after looking among the litter and up on the loft, and vere not, they opens the corn chest and finds that he'd been and chalked his vill inside the lid, so the lid was obligated to be took off the hinges and sent up to Doctor Commons to be proved, and under that ere wery instrument this here lantern was passed to Tony Veller, vich circumstance, mum, gives it a wally in my eyes, and makes me rekvest if you vill be so kind as to take particular care on it.' The housekeeper graciously promised to keep the object of Mr. Weller's regard in the safest possible custody, and Mr. Pickwick with a laughing face took his leave. The bodyguard followed, side by side, old Mr. Weller buttoned and wrapped up from his boots to his chin, and Sam with his hands in his pockets and his hat half off his head, remonstrating with his father as he went, on his extreme loquacity. I was not a little surprised, on turning to go upstairs, to encounter the barber in the passage at that late hour, for his attendance is usually confined to some half hour in the morning. But Jack Redburn, who finds out, by instinct I think, everything that happens in the house, informed me with great glee that a society in imitation of our own had been that night formed in the kitchen, under the title of Mr. Weller's Watch, of which the barber was a member, and that he could pledge himself to find means of making me acquainted with the whole of its future proceedings, which I begged him, both on my own account and that of my readers, by no means to neglect doing. Section 7 Master Humphrey's Clock, Section 7. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock, Chapter 5. Mr. Weller's Watch. It seems that the housekeeper and the two Mr. Wellers were no sooner left together on the occasion of their first becoming acquainted, than the housekeeper called to her assistance Mr. Slithers the barber, who had been lurking in the kitchen in expectation of her summons, and with many smiles and much sweetness introduced him as one who would assist her in the respectable office of entertaining her distinguished visitors. 'Indeed,' said she, 'without Mr. Slithers, I should have been placed in quite an awkward situation.' 'There's no call for any hawkwardness, mum,' said Mr. Weller, with the utmost politeness. 'No call whatsomever. A lady,' added the old gentleman, looking about him with the air of one who establishes an incontrovertible position, 'a lady can't be hawk'ard. Nature has otherwise purwided.' The housekeeper inclined her head and smiled yet more sweetly. The barber, who had been fluttering about Mr. Weller and Sam in a state of great anxiety to improve their acquaintance, rubbed his hands and cried, 'Hear, hear! Very true, sir!' Whereupon Sam turned about and steadily regarded him for some seconds in silence. 'I never knew,' said Sam, fixing his eyes in a ruminative manner upon the blushing barber, 'I never knew but vun of your trade but he was worth a dozen, and was indeed dewoted to his callin'.' 'Was he in the easy shaving ways, sir,' inquired Mr. Slithers, 'or in the cutting and curling line?' 'Both,' replied Sam. 'Easy shaving was his nature, and cutting and curling was his pride and glory. His whole delight was in his trade. He spent all his money in beers, and ran in debt for 'em besides. And there they was a growling away down in the front cellar all day long, and ineffectually gnashing their teeth, vile the grease of their relations and friends was being retailed in gallipots in the shop above, and the first floor winder was ornamented with their heads, not to speak of the dreadful aggrawation it must have been to 'em to see a man alvays a walking up and down the pavement outside with the portrait of a bear in his last agonies, and underneath in large letters, "Another fine animal was slaughtered yesterday at Jinkinson's." Hows'ever, there they was, and there Jinkinson was, till he was took wery ill with some inner disorder, lost the use of his legs, and was confined to his bed, for he laid a wery long time, but sich was his pride in his profession even then, that whenever he was worse than usual the doctor used to go downstairs and say, "Jinkinson's wery low this morning, we must give the bears a stir." And sure as ever they stirred him up a bit and made him raw, Jinkinson opens his eyes as if he was ever so bad, calls out, "There's the bears," and rewives again.' 'Astonishing!' cried the barber. 'Not a bit,' said Sam. 'Human natur' neat as imported. Vun day the doctor happening to say, "I shall look in as usual to morrow mornin'," Jinkinson catches hold of his hand, and says, "Doctor," he says, "will you grant me one favour?" "I will, Jinkinson," says the doctor. "Then, doctor," says Jinkinson, "vill you come unshaved, and let me shave you?" "I will," says the doctor. "God bless you," says Jinkinson. Next day the doctor came, and arter he'd been shaved all skilful and regular, he says, "Jinkinson," he says, "it's wery plain this does you good. Now," he says, "I've got a coachman as has got a beard that it 'ud warm your heart to work on, and though the footman," he says, "hasn't got much of a beard, still he's a trying it on vith a pair o' whiskers to that extent that raises his Christian charity. If they'd take it in turns to mind the carriage when it's a waiting below," he says, "what's to hinder you from operating on both of 'em every day as well as upon me? You've got 6 children," he says, "what's to hinder you from shaving all their heads and keeping 'em shaved? You've got 2 assistants in the shop downstairs, what's to hinder you from cutting and curling them as often as you like? Do this," he says, "and you're a man again." Jinkinson squeedged the doctor's hand and begun that wery day. He kept his tools upon the bed, and whenever he felt hisself getting worse, he turned to at vun of the children who was a running about the house with heads like clean Dutch cheeses, and shaved 'em again. One day the lawyer came to make his will. All the time he was a taking it down, Jinkinson was secretly a clipping away at his hair vith a large pair o' scissors. "What's that 'ere snipping noise?" says the lawyer every now and then. "It's like a man having his hair cut." "It is wery like a man having his hair cut," says poor Jinkinson, hiding the scissors and looking quite innocent. "By the time the lawyer found it out he was wery nearly bald. Jinkinson was kept alive in this vay for a long time, but at last vun day he hes in all the children vun after another, shaves each on 'em wery clean, and gives 'em vun kiss on the crown of the head, then he hes in the two assistants, and arter cutting and curling of 'em in the first style of elegance, says he should like to hear the woice of the greasiest bear, vich request is immediately complied with. Then he says he feels wery happy in his mind and wishes to be left alone, and then he dies, previously cutting his own hair and making one flat curl in the wery middle of his forehead." This anecdote produced an extraordinary effect, not only upon Mr. Slithers, but upon the housekeeper too, who evinced so much anxiety to please and be pleased, that Mr. Weller, with a manner betokening some alarm, conveyed a whispered inquiry to his son whether he had gone too fur. "What do you mean by too fur?" demanded Sam. "In that 'ere little compliment respectin' the want of hawkardness in ladies, Sammy," replied his father. "You don't think she's fallen in love with you in consequence o' that, do you?" said Sam. "More unlikelier things have come to pass, my boy," replied Mr. Weller in a hoarse whisper. "I'm always afeerd of inadwertent captiwation, Sammy. If I know'd how to make myself ugly or unpleasant, I'd do it, Samivel, rather than live in this here state of perpetual terror." Mr. Weller had at that time no further opportunity of dwelling upon the apprehensions which beset his mind, for the immediate occasion of his fears proceeded to lead the way downstairs, apologising as they went for conducting him into the kitchen, which apartment, however, she was induced to proffer for his accommodation in preference to her own little room, the rather as it afforded greater facilities for smoking, and was immediately adjoining the ale cellar. The preparations which were already made sufficiently proved that these were not mere words of course, for on the deal table were a sturdy ale jug and glasses, flanked with clean pipes and a plentiful supply of tobacco for the old gentleman and his son, while on a dresser hard by was goodly store of cold meat and other eatables. At sight of these arrangements, Mr. Weller was at first distracted between his love of joviality and his doubts whether they were not to be considered as so many evidences of captivation having already taken place; but he soon yielded to his natural impulse, and took his seat at the table with a very jolly countenance. "As to imbibing any of this here flagrant veed, mum, in the presence of a lady," said Mr. Weller, taking up a pipe and laying it down again, "it couldn't be. Samivel, total abstinence, if you please." "But I like it, of all things," said the housekeeper. "No," rejoined Mr. Weller, shaking his head, "no." "Upon my word I do," said the housekeeper. "Mr. Slithers knows I do." Mr. Weller coughed, and notwithstanding the barber's confirmation of the statement, said no again, but more feebly than before. The housekeeper lighted a piece of paper, and insisted on applying it to the bowl of the pipe with her own fair hands. Mr. Weller resisted. The housekeeper cried that her fingers would be burnt. Mr. Weller gave way. The pipe was ignited, and Mr. Weller drew a long puff of smoke, and detecting himself in the very act of smiling on the housekeeper, put a sudden constraint upon his countenance, and looked sternly at the candle, with a determination not to captivate himself or encourage thoughts of captivation in others. From this iron frame of mind he was roused by the voice of his son. "I don't think," said Sam, who was smoking with great composure and enjoyment, "that if the lady wos agreeable, it 'ud be wery far out of the way for us four to make up a club of our own like the governess does upstairs, and let him," Sam pointed with the stem of his pipe towards the parent, "be the president." The housekeeper affably declared that it was the very thing she had been thinking of. The barber said the same. Mr. Weller said nothing, but he laid down his pipe as if in a fit of inspiration, and performed the following manoeuvres. Unbuttoning the three lower buttons of his waistcoat, and pausing for a moment to enjoy the easy flow of breath consequent upon this process, he laid violent hands upon his watch chain, and slowly and with extreme difficulty drew from his fob an immense double cased silver watch, which brought the lining of the pocket with it, and was not to be disentangled but by great exertions and an amazing redness of face. Having fairly got it out at last, he detached the outer case and wound it up with a key of corresponding magnitude, then put the case on again, and having applied the watch to his ear to ascertain that it was still going, gave it some half dozen hard knocks on the table to improve its performance. 'That,' said Mr. Weller, laying it on the table with its face upwards, 'is the title and emblem o' this here society. Sammy, reach them two stools this vay for the wacant chairs. Ladies and gen'lmen, Mr. Weller's watch is found up and now a going. Order!' By way of enforcing this proclamation, Mr. Weller, using the watch after the manner of a president's hammer, and remarking with great pride that nothing hurt it, and that falls and concussions of all kinds materially enhanced the excellence of the works and assisted the regulator, knocked the table a great many times, and declared the association formally constituted. 'And don't let's have no grinning at the cheer, Samivel,' said Mr. Weller to his son, 'or I shall be committing you to the cellar, and then p'raps we may get into what the 'Mericans call a fix, and the English a question of privileges.' Having uttered this friendly caution, the president settled himself in his chair with great dignity, and requested that Samuel would relate an anecdote. 'I've told one,' said Sam. 'Very good, sir. Tell another,' returned the chair. 'We was a talking just now, sir,' said Sam, turning to Slithers, 'about barbers. Pursuing that 'ere fruitful theme, sir, I'll tell you, in a wery few words, a romantic little story about another barber as p'raps you may never have heard.' 'Samivel,' said Mr. Weller, again bringing his watch and the table into smart collision, 'address your obserwations to the chair, and not to private indiwiduals.' 'And if I might rise to order,' said the barber in a soft voice, and looking round him with a conciliatory smile as he leant over the table, with the knuckles of his left hand resting upon it, 'if I might rise to order, I would suggest that "barbers" is not exactly the kind of language which is agreeable and soothing to our feelings. You, sir, will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there is such a word in the dictionary as hairdressers.' 'Well, but suppose he wasn't a hairdresser?' suggested Sam. 'Why then, sir, be parliamentary and call him vun all the more,' returned his father. 'In the same vay as every gentleman in another place is a honourable, every barber in this place is a hairdresser. Ven you read the speeches in the papers and see as vun gentleman says of another, "the honourable member," if he vill allow me to call him so, you vill understand, sir, that that means, if he vill allow me to keep up that 'ere pleasant and uniwersal fiction.' It is a common remark, confirmed by history and experience, that great men rise with the circumstances in which they are placed. Mr. Weller came out so strong in his capacity of chairman, that Sam was for some time prevented from speaking by a grin of surprise, which held his faculties enchained, and at last subsided in a long whistle of a single note. Nay, the old gentleman appeared even to have astonished himself, and that to no small extent, as was demonstrated by the vast amount of chuckling in which he indulged after the utterance of these lucid remarks. 'Here's the story,' said Sam. 'Vunce upon a time there was a young hairdresser as opened a wery smart little shop with 4 wax dummies in the winder, 2 gentlemen and 2 ladies, the gentlemen with blue dots for their beards, wery large whiskers, audacious heads of hair, uncommon clear eyes, and nostrils of amazin' pinkness; the ladies vith their heads o' one side, their right forefingers on their lips, and their forms deweloped beautiful, in vich last respect they had the adwantage over the gentlemen as wasn't allowed but wery little shoulder, and terminated rather abrupt in fancy drapery. He had also a many hair brushes and tooth brushes bottled up in the winder, neat glass cases on the counter, a floor cloth cuttin' room upstairs, and weighin' machine in the shop right opposite the door. But the great attraction and ornament was the dummies, which this here young hairdresser was constantly a running out in the road to look at, and constantly a running in again to touch up and polish. In short, he was so proud on 'em that ven Sunday came he was always wretched and miserable to think they was behind the shutters, and looked anxiously for Monday on that account. Vun of these dummies was a favourite vith him beyond the others, and ven any of his acquaintance asked him why he didn't get married, as the young ladies he knowed in particular often did, he used to say, never. I never vill enter into the bonds of vedlock," he says, "until I meet with a young woman as realises my idea of that 'ere fairest dummy with the light hair. Then, and not till then," he says, "I vill approach the altar." All the young ladies he knowed as had got dark hair told him that this was wery sinful, and that he was worshipping a idol; but them as was at all near the same shade as the dummy coloured up wery much, and was observed to think him a wery nice young man. "Samivel," said Mr. Weller, gravely, "a member o' this association being one o' that 'ere tender sex which is now immediately referred to, I have to request that you vill make no reflections." "I ain't a making any, am I?" inquired Sam. "Order, sir!" returned Mr. Weller with severe dignity. Then, sinking the chairman in the father, he added, in his usual tone of voice, "Samivel, drive on." Sam interchanged a smile with the housekeeper, and proceeded. The young hairdresser hadn't been in the habit o' making this avowal above 6 months, ven he encountered a young lady as was the very pictur o' the fairest dummy. "Now," he says, "it's all up, I am a slave." The young lady was not only the pictur o' the fairest dummy, but she was wery romantic as the young hairdresser was too, and he says, "Oh," he says, "here's a community o' feelin', here's a flow o' soul," he says, "here's a interchange o' sentiment." The young lady didn't say much, o' course, but she expressed herself agreeable, and shortly aftervards vent to see him with a mutual friend. The hairdresser rushes out to meet her, but directly she sees the dummy she changes colour and falls a tremblin' wiolently. "Look up, my love," says the hairdresser. "Behold your image in my winder. Be not correcter than in my art." "My image!" he said. "Yourn," replied the hairdresser. "But whose image is that?" she says, a pointing at vun o' the gentlemen. "No vun's, my love," he says. "It is but an idea." "A idea!" she cries. "It is a portrait. I feel it is a portrait, and that 'ere noble face must be in the millingtary." "What do I hear?" says he, a crumplin' his curls. "Villiam Gibbs," she says, quite firm, "never renew the subject. I respect you as a friend," she says, "but my affections is set upon that manly brow." "This," says the hairdresser, "is a regular blight, and in it I perceive the hand of fate. Farevell." Vith these vords he rushes into the shop, breaks the dummy's nose with a blow of his curlin' irons, melts him down at the parlour fire, and never smiles aftervards. "The young lady, Mr. Weller?" said the housekeeper. "Why, ma'am," said Sam, "finding that Fate had a spite agin her, and everybody she come into contact vith, she never smiled neither, but read a deal o' poetry and pined away, by rather slow degrees, for she ain't dead yet. It took a deal o' poetry to kill the hairdresser, and some people say arter all that it was more the gin and water as caused him to be run over. P'raps it was a little o' both, and came o' mixing the two." The barber declared that Mr. Weller had related one of the most interesting stories that had ever come within his knowledge, in which opinion the housekeeper entirely concurred. "Are you a married man, sir?" inquired Sam. The barber replied that he had not that honour. "I suppose you mean to be?" said Sam. "Well," replied the barber, rubbing his hands smirkingly, "I don't know. I don't think it's very likely." "That's a bad sign," said Sam. "If you'd said you meant to be vun o' these days, I should ha' looked upon you as being safe. You're in a wery precarious state." "I am not conscious of any danger, at all events," returned the barber. "No more was I, sir," said the elder Mr. Weller, interposing. "Those vere my symptoms exactly. I been took that vay twice. Keep your vether eye open, my friend, or you're gone." There was something so very solemn about this admonition, both in its matter and manner, and also in the way in which Mr. Weller still kept his eye fixed upon the unsuspecting victim, that nobody cared to speak for some little time, and might not have cared to do so for some time longer, if the housekeeper had not happened to sigh, which called off the old gentleman's attention, and gave rise to a general inquiry whether there was anything wery piercing in thot ere little heart. "Dear me, Mr. Weller," said the housekeeper, laughing. "No, but is there anything as agitates it?" pursued the old gentleman. "Has it always been obdurate, always opposed to the happiness o' human creeturs, has it?" At this critical juncture for her blushes and confusion, the housekeeper discovered that more ale was wanted, and hastily withdrew into the cellar to draw the same, followed by the barber, who insisted on carrying the candle. Having looked after her with a very complacent expression of face, and after him with some disdain, Mr. Weller caused his glance to travel slowly round the kitchen, until at length it rested on his son. "Sammy," said Mr. Weller,
I mistrust that barber.' 'What for?' returned Sam. 'What's he got to do with you? You're a nice man, you are, after pretending all kinds of terror to go and paying compliments and talking about hearts and pierces.' The imputation of gallantry appeared to afford Mr. Weller the utmost delight, for he replied in a voice choked by suppressed laughter, and with the tears in his eyes: 'Was I a talking about hearts and pierces, was I though, Sammy, eh? Was you? Of course you was. She don't know no better, Sammy, there ain't no harm in it, no danger, Sammy, she's only a punster. She seemed pleased though, didn't she? O' course she was pleased, it's natural she should be, wery natural.' 'He's wine of it!' exclaimed Sam, joining in his father's mirth. 'He's actually wine!' 'Hush!' replied Mr. Weller, composing his features. 'They're a coming back, this little heart's a coming back. But mark these words o' mine once more, and remember 'em ven your father says he said 'em. Samivel, I mistrust that 'ere deceitful barber.' End o' section 7.
Master Humphrey's Clock, Section 8. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock by Charles Dickens, Section 8, Chapter 6, Part 1. Master Humphrey from his clock side in the chimney corner. 2 or 3 evenings after the institution of Mr. Weller's watch, I thought I heard, as I walked in the garden, the voice of Mr. Weller himself at no great distance, and stopping once or twice to listen more attentively, I found that the sounds proceeded from my housekeeper's little sitting room, which is at the back of the house. I took no further notice of the circumstance at that time, but it formed the subject of a conversation between me and my friend Jack Redburn next morning, when I found that I had not been deceived in my impression. Jack furnished me with the following particulars, and as he appeared to take extraordinary pleasure in relating them, I have begged him in future to jot down any such domestic scenes or occurrences that may please his humour, in order that they may be told in his own way. I must confess that as Mr. Pickwick and he are constantly together, I have been influenced in making this request by a secret desire to know something of their proceedings. On the evening in question, the housekeeper's room was arranged with particular care, and the housekeeper herself was very smartly dressed. The preparations, however, were not confined to mere showy demonstrations, as tea was prepared for 3 persons, with a small display of preserves and jams and sweet cakes, which heralded some uncommon occasion. Miss Benton (my housekeeper bears that name) was in a state of great expectation too, frequently going to the front door and looking anxiously down the lane, and more than once observing to the servant girl that she expected company, and hoped no accident had happened to delay them. A modest ring at the bell at length allayed her fears, and Miss Benton, hurrying into her own room and shutting herself up, in order that she might preserve that appearance of being taken by surprise which is so essential to the polite reception of visitors, awaited their coming with a smiling countenance. 'Good evening, mum,' said the older Mr. Weller, looking in at the door after a prefatory tap. 'I'm afeard we've come in rayther arter the time, mum, but the young colt being full o' ice has been a bolting and shying and getting his leg over the traces to such a extent, that if he ain't wery soon broke in, he'll wex me into a broken heart, and then he'll never be brought out no more except to learn his letters from the writing on his grandfather's tombstone.' With these pathetic words, which were addressed to something outside the door about 2 feet 6 from the ground, Mr. Weller introduced a very small boy firmly set upon a couple of very sturdy legs, who looked as if nothing could ever knock him down. Besides having a very round face strongly resembling Mr. Weller's, and a stout little body of exactly his build, this young gentleman, standing with his little legs very wide apart, as if the top boots were familiar to them, actually winked upon the housekeeper with his infant eye, in imitation of his grandfather. 'There's a naughty boy, mum,' said Mr. Weller, bursting with delight. 'There's a immoral Tony! Was there ever a little chap of 4 years and 8 months old as vinked his eye at a strange lady afore? As little affected by this observation as by the former appeal to his feelings, Master Weller elevated in the air a small model of a coach whip which he carried in his hand, and addressing the housekeeper with a shrill "Yah, hip!" inquired if she was going down the road, at which happy adaptation of a lesson he had been taught from infancy, Mr. Weller could restrain his feelings no longer, but gave him twopence on the spot.
It's in wain to deny it, mum,' said Mr. Weller. 'This here is a boy arter his grandfather's own heart, and beats out all the boys as ever was or will be. Though at the same time, mum,' added Mr. Weller, trying to look gravely down upon his favourite, 'it was wery wrong on him to want to, over all the posts as we come along, and wery cruel on him to force poor grandfather to lift him cross legged over every vun of 'em. He wouldn't pass vun single blessed post, mum, and at the top of the lane that's 7 and 40 on 'em all in a row, and wery close together.' Here Mr. Weller, whose feelings were in a perpetual conflict between pride in his grandson's achievement, and a sense of his own responsibility, and the importance of impressing him with moral truths, burst into a fit of laughter, and suddenly checking himself, remarked in a severe tone that little boys as made their grandfathers put 'em over post never went to heaven at any price. By this time the housekeeper had made tea, and little Tony, placed on a chair beside her, with his eyes nearly on a level with the top of the table, was provided with various delicacies which yielded him extreme contentment. The housekeeper, who seemed rather afraid of the child, notwithstanding her caresses, then patted him on the head, and declared that he was the finest boy she had ever seen. 'Why, mum,' said Mr. Weller, 'I don't think you'll see a many sich, and that's the truth. But if my son Samivel would give me my vay, ma'am, and only dispense with his, might I wentur to say the word?' 'What word, Mr. Weller?' said the housekeeper, blushing slightly. 'Petticuts, mum,' returned that gentleman, laying his hand upon the garments of his grandson. 'If my son Samivel, mum, would only dispense with these here, you'd see such an alteration in his appearance as the imagination can't depicter.'
'But what would you have the child wear instead, Mr. Weller?' said the housekeeper.
'I've offered my son Samivel, mum, again and again,' returned the old gentleman, 'to perwide him, at my own cost, with a suit of clothes as 'ud be the making on him, and form his mind in infancy for those pursuits as I hope the family of the Vellers will always dewote themselves to. Tony, my boy, tell the lady what them clothes are as grandfather says father ought to let you vear.'
'A little white hat, and a little sprig waistcoat, and little neat cords, and little top boots, and a little green coat with little bright buttons, and a little welwet collar,' replied Tony with great readiness, and no stops.
'That's the costume, mum,' said Mr. Weller, looking proudly at the housekeeper. 'Once make such a model on him as that, and you'd say he wos an angel.'
Perhaps the housekeeper thought that in such a guise young Tony would look more like the angel at Islington than anything else of that name, or perhaps she was disconcerted to find her previously conceived ideas disturbed, as angels are not commonly represented in top boots and sprig waistcoats. She coughed doubtfully, but said nothing. 'How many brothers and sisters have you, my dear?' she asked, after a short silence.
'One brother and no sister at all,' replied Tony. 'Sam his name is, and so's my father's. Do you know my father?'
'Oh yes, I know him,' said the housekeeper graciously.
'Is my father fond of you?'
pursued Tony. 'I hope so,' rejoined the smiling housekeeper. Tony considered a moment, and then said,
'Is my grandfather fond of you?'
This would seem a very easy question to answer, but instead of replying to it, the housekeeper smiled in great confusion, and said that really children did ask such extraordinary questions that it was the most difficult thing in the world to talk to them. Mr. Weller took upon himself to reply that he was very fond of the lady, but the housekeeper entreating that he would not put such things into the child's head, Mr. Weller shook his own while she looked another way, and seemed to be troubled with a misgiving that captivation was in progress. It was perhaps on this account that he changed the subject precipitately.
'It's wery wrong in little boys to make game o' their grandfathers, ain't it, mum?' said Mr. Weller, shaking his head waggishly, until Tony looked at him, when he counterfeited the deepest dejection and sorrow. 'Oh, very sad,' assented the housekeeper, 'but I hope no little boys do that. There is vun young Turk, mum,' said Mr. Weller, 'as having seen his grandfather a little overcome vith drink on the occasion of a friend's birthday, goes a reeling and staggering about the house, and making believe that he's the old gentleman.'
'Oh, quite shocking!' cried the housekeeper.
'Yes, mum,' said Mr. Weller, 'and previously to so doing, this here young traitor that I'm a speaking of, pinches his little nose to make it red, and then he gives a hiccup and says, "I'm all right," he says, "give us another song. Ha ha! Give us another song," he says. Ha ha ha!'
In his excessive delight, Mr. Weller was quite unmindful of his moral responsibility, until little Tony kicked up his legs, and laughing immoderately, cried, 'That was me, that was;' whereupon the grandfather, by a great effort, became extremely solemn.
'No, Tony, not you,' said Mr. Weller. 'I hope it warn't you, Tony. It must ha' been that 'ere naughty little chap as comes sometimes out of the empty watch box round the corner, the same little chap as was found standing on the table afore the looking glass, pretending to shave himself with a oyster knife.'
'He didn't hurt himself, I hope?' observed the housekeeper.
'Not he, mum,' said Mr. Weller proudly. 'Bless your heart, you might trust that 'ere boy with a steam engine a'most, he's such a knowing young.'
But suddenly recollecting himself, and observing that Tony perfectly understood and appreciated the compliment, the old gentleman groaned, and observed that it was
all wery shocking, wery. 'Oh, he's a bad 'un,' said Mr. Weller, 'is that 'ere watch box boy, making such a noise and litter in the back yard, he does, waterin' wooden horses and feeding of 'em with grass, and perpetivally spilling his little brother out of a veelbarrow and frightening his mother out of her vits, at the wery moment when she's expecting to increase his stock of happiness vith another playfeller. Oh, he's a bad one. He's even gone so far as to put on a pair of paper spectacles as he got his father to make for him, and valk up and down the garden vith his hands behind him in imitation of Mr. Pickwick. But Tony don't do such things. Oh no!'
'Oh no!' echoed Tony.
'He knows better, he does,' said Mr. Weller. 'He knows that if he was to come such games as these nobody wouldn't love him, and that his grandfather in particular couldn't abear the sight on him, for vich reasons Tony's always good.'
'Always good!' echoed Tony, and his grandfather immediately took him on his knee and kissed him; at the same time, with many nods and winks, slyly pointing at the child's head with his thumb, in order that the housekeeper, otherwise deceived by the admirable manner in which he (Mr. Weller) had sustained his character, might not suppose that any other young gentleman was referred to, and might clearly understand that the boy of the watch box was but an imaginary creation, and a fetch of Tony himself, invented for his improvements and reformation. Not confining himself to a mere verbal description of his grandson's abilities, Mr. Weller, when tea was finished, invited him by various gifts of pence and halfpence to smoke imaginary pipes, drink visionary beer from real pots, imitate his grandfather without reserve, and in particular to go through the drunken scene which threw the old gentleman into ecstasies and filled the housekeeper with wonder. Nor was Mr. Weller's pride satisfied with even this display, for when he took his leave he carried the child, like some rare and astonishing curiosity, first to the barber's house, and afterwards to the tobacconist's, at each of which places he repeated his performances with the utmost effect to applauding and delighted audiences. It was half past 9 o'clock when Mr. Weller was last seen carrying him home upon his shoulder, and it has been whispered abroad that at that time the infant Tony was rather intoxicated. I was musing the other evening upon the characters and incidents with which I have been so long engaged, wondering how I could ever have looked forward with pleasure to the completion of my tale, and reproaching myself for having done so, as if it were a kind of cruelty to those companions of my solitude whom I had now dismissed and could never again recall, when my clock struck 10. Punctual to the hour, my friends appeared. On our last night of meeting, we had finished the story which the reader has just concluded. Our conversation took the same current as the meditations which the entrance of my friends had interrupted, and the old curiosity shop was the staple of our discourse. I may confide to the reader now that in connection with this little history I had something upon my mind, something to communicate which I had all along with difficulty repressed, something I had deemed it, during the progress of the story, necessary to its interest to disguise, and which, now that it was over, I wished, and was yet reluctant, to disclose. To conceal anything from those to whom I am attached is not in my nature. I can never close my lips where I have opened my heart. This temper, and the consciousness of having done some violence to it in my narrative, laid me under a restraint which I should have had great difficulty in overcoming, but for a timely remark from Mr. Miles, who, as I hinted in a former paper, is a gentleman of business habits, and of great exactness and propriety in all his transactions. 'I could have wished,' my friend objected, 'that we had been made acquainted with the single gentleman's name. I don't like his withholding his name. It made me look upon him at first with suspicion, and caused me to doubt his moral character, I assure you. I am finally satisfied by this time of his being a worthy creature, but in this respect he certainly would not appear to have acted at all like a man of business.' 'My friends,' said I, drawing to the table, at which they were by this time seated in their usual chairs, 'do you remember that this story bore another title besides that one we have so often heard of late?' Mr. Miles had his pocket book out in an instant, and referring to an entry therein, rejoined, 'Certainly. Personal Adventures of Master Humphrey. Here it is. I made a note of it at the time.' I was about to resume what I had to tell them, when the same Mr. Miles again interrupted me, observing that the narrative originated in a personal adventure of my own, and that was no doubt the reason for its being thus designated. This led me to the point at once. 'You will one and all forgive me,' I returned, 'if for the greater convenience of the story, and for its better introduction, that adventure was fictitious. I had my share, indeed, no light or trivial one, in the pages we have read, but it was not the share I feigned to have at first. The younger brother, the single gentleman, the nameless actor in this little drama, stands before you now.' It was easy to see that they had not expected this disclosure. 'Yes,' I pursued, 'I can look back upon my part in it with a calm, half smiling pity for myself as for some other man. But I am he indeed, and now the chief sorrows of my life are yours.' I need not say what true gratification I derived from the sympathy and kindness with which this acknowledgment was received, nor how it often had risen to my lips before, nor how difficult I had found it, how impossible, when I came to these passages which touched me most, and most nearly concerned me, to sustain the character I had assumed. It is enough to say that I replaced in the clock case the record of so many trials, sorrowfully it is true, but with a softened sorrow which was almost pleasure, and felt that in living through the past again, and communicating to others the lesson it had helped to teach me, I had been a happier man. We lingered so long over the leaves from which I had read, that as I consigned them to their former resting place, the hand of my trusty clock pointed to 12, and there came towards us upon the wind the voice of the deep and distant bell of St. Paul's, as it struck the hour of midnight. 'This,' said I, returning with a manuscript I had taken at the moment from the same repository, 'to be opened to such music, should be a tale where London's face by night is darkly seen, and where some deed of such a time as this is dimly shadowed out. Which of us here has seen the working of that great machine whose voice has just now ceased?' Mr. Pickwick had, of course, and so had Mr. Miles. Jack and my deaf friend were in the minority. I had seen it but a few days before, and could not help telling them of the fancy I had about it. I paid my fee of twopence upon entering to one of the money changers who sit within the Temple, and falling, after a few turns up and down, into the quiet train of thought which such a place awakens, paced the echoing stones like some old monk whose present world lay all within its walls. As I looked afar up into the lofty dome, I could not help wondering what were his reflections whose genius reared that mighty pile, when, the last small wedge of timber fixed, the last nail driven into its home for many centuries, the clang of hammers and the hum of busy voices gone, and the great silence whole years of noise had helped to make, reigning undisturbed around, he mused as I did now upon his work, and lost himself amid its vast extent. I could not quite determine whether the contemplation of it would impress him with a sense of greatness or of insignificance. But when I remembered how long a time it had taken to erect, in how short a space it might be traversed even to its remotest parts, for how brief a term he, or any of those who cared to bear his name, would live to see it, or know of its existence, I imagined him far more melancholy than proud, and looking with regret upon his labour done. With these thoughts in my mind, I began to ascend, almost unconsciously, the flight of steps leading to the several wonders of the building, and found myself before a barrier where another money taker sat, who demanded which among them I would choose to see. There were the stone gallery, he said, and the whispering gallery, the geometrical staircase, the room of models, the clock being quite in my way, I stopped him there, and chose that sight from all the rest. I groped my way into the turret which it occupies, and saw before me, in a kind of loft, what seemed to be a great old oaken press with folding doors. These being thrown back by the attendant, who was sleeping when I came upon him, and looked a little drowsy fellow, as though his close companionship with time had made him quite indifferent to it, disclosed a complicated crowd of wheels and chains in iron and brass, great, sturdy, rattling engines, suggestive of breaking a finger putting here or there and grinding the bone to powder, and those were the clock. Its very pulse, if I may use the word, was like no other clock. It did not mark the flight of every moment with a gentle second stroke as though it would check old Time and have him stay his pace in pity, but it measured it with one sledge-hammer beat, as if its business were to crush the seconds as they came trooping on, and remorselessly to clear a path before the day of judgment. I sat down opposite to it, and hearing its regular and never changing voice, that one deep constant note, uppermost amongst all the noise and clatter in the streets below, marking that, lest the tumult rise or fall, go on or stop, let it be night or noon, to-morrow or next day, this year or next, it still performed its functions with the same dull constancy, and regulated the progress of the life around, the fancy came upon me that this was London's heart, and that when it should cease to beat, the city would be no more. It is night. Calm and unmoved amidst the scenes that darkness favours, the great heart of London throbs in its giant breast. Wealth and beggary, vice and virtue, guilt and innocence, repletion and the direst hunger, all treading on each other and crowding together, are gathered round it. Draw but a little circle above the clustering housetops, and you shall have within its space everything, with its opposite extreme and contradiction close beside. Where yonder feeble light is shining, a man is but this moment dead. The taper at a few yards' distance is seen by eyes that have this instant opened on the world. There are two houses separated by but an inch or two of wall. In one, there are quiet minds at rest; in the other, a waking conscience that one might think would trouble the very air. In that close corner where the roofs shrink down and cower together as if to hide their secrets from the handsome street hard by, there are such dark crimes, such misery and horrors, as could be hardly told in whispers. In the handsome street there are folks asleep who have dwelt there all their lives, and have no more knowledge of these things than if they had never been, or were transacted at the remotest limits of the world; who, if they were hinted at, would shake their heads, look wise, and frown, and say they were impossible and out of nature, as if all great towns were not. Does not this heart of London, that nothing moves, nor stops, nor quickens, that goes on the same let what will be done, does it not express the city's character well? The day begins to break, and soon there is the hum and noise of life. Those who have spent the night on doorsteps and cold stones crawl off to beg; they who have slept in beds come forth to their occupation too, and business is astir. The fog of sleep rolls slowly off, and London shines awake. The streets are filled with carriages and people gaily clad. The jails are full too, to the throat, nor have the workhouses or hospitals much room to spare. The courts of law are crowded. Taverns have their regular frequenters by this time, and every mart of traffic has its throng. Each of these places is a world, and has its own inhabitants. Each is distinct from, and almost unconscious of the existence of any other. There are some few people well to do who remember to have heard it said, that numbers of men and women thousands they think it was get up in London every day, unknowing where to lay their heads at night, and that there are quarters of the town where misery and famine always are. They don't believe it, quite. There may be some truth in it, but it is exaggerated, of course. So each of these thousand worlds goes on, intent upon itself, until night comes again, first with its lights and pleasures, and its cheerful streets, then with its guilt and darkness. Heart of London, there is a moral in thy every stroke, as I look on in thy indomitable working, which neither death nor press of life, nor grief nor gladness out of doors, will influence one jot. I seem to hear a voice within thee which sinks into my heart, bidding me, as I elbow my way among the crowd, have some thought for the meanest wretch that passes, and, being a man, to turn away with scorn and pride from none that bear the human shape. I am by no means sure that I might not have been tempted to enlarge upon the subject, had not the papers that lay before me on the table been a silent reproach for even this digression. I took them up again when I had got thus far, and seriously prepared to read. The handwriting was strange to me, for the manuscript had been fairly copied. As it is against our rules in such a case to inquire into the authorship until the reading is concluded, I could only glance at the different faces round me, in search of some expression which should betray the writer. Whoever he might be, he was prepared for this, and gave no sign for my enlightenment. I had the papers in my hand, when my deaf friend interposed with a suggestion. "It has occurred to me," he said, "bearing in mind your sequel to the tale we have finished, that if such of us as have anything to relate of our own lives could interweave it with our contribution to the clock, it would be well to do so. This need be no restraint upon us, either as to time, or place, or incident, since any real passage of this kind may be surrounded by fictitious circumstances, and represented by fictitious characters. What if we make this an article of agreement among ourselves?" The proposition was cordially received, but the difficulty appeared to be that here was a long story written before we had thought of it. "Unless," said I, "it should have happened that the writer of this tale, which is not impossible, for men are apt to do so when they write, has actually mingled it with something of his own endurance and experience." Nobody spoke, but I thought I detected in one quarter that this was really the case. "If I have no assurance to the contrary," I added therefore, "I shall take it for granted that he has done so, and even these papers come within our new agreement. Everybody being mute, we hold that understanding, if you please." And here I was about to begin again, when Jack informed us softly that during the progress of our last narrative, Mr. Weller's watch had adjourned its settings from the kitchen, and regularly met outside our door, which he had no doubt that august body would be found at the present moment. As this was for the convenience of listening to our stories, he submitted that they might be suffered to come in, and hear them more pleasantly. To this we one and all yielded a ready assent, and the party being discovered, as Jack had supposed, and invited to walk in, entered, though not without great confusion at having been detected, and were accommodated with cheers at a little distance. Then the lamp being trimmed, the fire well stirred and burning brightly, the hearth clean swept, the curtains closely drawn, the clock wound up, we entered on our new story. Section 8. Master Humphrey's Clock, Section 9. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock by Charles Dickens, Section 9. Chapter 6, Part 2, Master Humphrey from his Clockside, continued. It is again midnight. My fire burns cheerfully, the room is filled with my old friend's sober voice, and I am left to muse upon the story we have just now finished. It makes me smile at such a time as this, to think if there were any one to see me sitting in my easy-chair, my grey head hanging down, my eyes bent thoughtfully upon the glowing embers, and my crutch, emblem of my helplessness, lying upon the hearth at my feet, how solitary I should seem. Yet though I am the sole tenant of this chimney-corner, though I am childless and old, I have no sense of loneliness at this hour, but am the centre of a silent group whose company I love. Thus even age and weakness have their consolations. If I were a younger man, if I were more active, more strongly bound and tied to life, these visionary friends would shun me, or I should desire to fly from them. Being what I am, I can court their society and delight in it, and pass whole hours in picturing to myself the shadows that perchance flock every night into this chamber, and in imagining with pleasure what kind of interest they have in the frail feeble mortal who is its sole inhabitant. All the friends I have ever lost I find again among these visitors. I love to fancy their spirits hovering about me, feeling still some earthly kindness for their old companion, and watching his decay. He is weaker, he declines apace, he draws nearer and nearer to us, and will soon be conscious of our existence. What is there to alarm me in this? It is encouragement and hope. These thoughts have never crowded on me half so fast as they have done to-night. Faces I have long forgotten have become familiar to me once again. Traits I had endeavoured to recall for years have come before me in an instant. Nothing is changed but me, and even I can be my former self at will. Raising my eyes but now to the face of my old clock, I remember, quite involuntarily, the veneration, not unmixed with a sort of childish awe, with which I used to sit and watch it as it ticked, unheeded, in a dark staircase corner. I recollect looking more grave and steady when I met its dusty face, as if, having that strange kind of life within it, and being free from all excess of vulgar appetite, and warning all the house by day and night, it were a sage. How often have I listened to it as it told the beads of time, and wondered at its constancy! How often watched it slowly pointing round the dial, and while I panted for the eagerly expected hour to come, admired, despite myself, its steadiness of purpose and lofty freedom from all human strife, impatience, and desire. I thought it cruel once. It was very hard of heart to my mind, I remember. It was an old servant even then, and I felt as though it ought to show some sorrow, as though it wanted sympathy with us in our distress, and were a dull, heartless, mercenary creature. Ah, how soon I learnt to know that in its ceaseless going on, and in its being checked or stayed by nothing, lay its greatest kindness, and the only balm for grief and wounded peace of mind. To-night, to-night, when this tranquillity and calm are on my spirits, and memory presents so many shifting scenes before me, I take my quiet stand at will by many a fire that has been long extinguished, and mingle with the cheerful group that cluster round it. If I could be sorrowful in such a mood, I should grow sad to think what a poor blot I was upon their youth and beauty once, and now how few remain to put me to the blush. I should grow sad to think that such among them as I sometimes meet with in my daily walks are scarcely less infirm than I, that time has brought us to a level, and that all distinctions fade and vanish as we take our trembling steps towards the grave. But memory was given us for better purposes than this, and mine is not a torment, but a source of pleasure. To muse upon the gaiety and youth I have known suggests to me glad scenes of harmless mirth that may be passing now. From contemplating them apart I soon become an actor in these little dramas, and humouring my fancy lose myself among the beings it invokes. When my fire is bright and high, and a warm blush mantles in the walls and ceilings of this ancient room, when my clock makes cheerful music like one of those chirping insects who delight in the warm hearth, and are sometimes by a good superstition looked upon as the harbingers of fortune and plenty to that household in whose mercies they put their humble trust, when everything is in a ruddy genial glow, and there are voices in the crackling flame and smiles in its flashing light, other smiles and other voices congregate around me, invading with their pleasant harmony the silence of the time. For then a knot of youthful creatures gather round my fireside, and the room re-echoes to their merry voices. My solitary chair no longer holds its ample place before the fire, but is wheeled into a smaller corner to leave more room for the broad circle formed about the cheerful hearth. I have sons, and daughters, and grandchildren, and we are assembled on some occasion of rejoicing common to us all. It is a birthday, perhaps, or perhaps it may be Christmas time, but be it what it may, there is rare holiday among us. We are full of glee. In the chimney corner opposite myself sits one who has grown old beside me. She is changed, of course, much changed, and yet I recognize the girl even in that grey hair and wrinkled brow. Glancing from the laughing child who half hides in her ample skirts and half peeps out, and from her to the little matron of 12 years old, who sits so womanly and so demure at no great distance from me, and from her again to a fair girl in the full bloom of early womanhood, the centre of the group, who has glanced more than once towards the opening door, and by whom the children, whispering and tittering among themselves, will leave a vacant chair, although she bids them not. I see her image thrice repeated, and feel how long it is before one form and set of features wholly pass away, if ever, from among the living. While I am dwelling upon this and tracing out the gradual change from infancy to youth, from youth to perfect growth, from that to age, and thinking with an old man's pride that she is comely yet, I feel a slight thin hand upon my arm, and looking down see seated at my feet a crippled boy, a gentle, patient child, whose aspect I know well. He rests upon a little crutch, I know it too, and leaning on it as he climbs my footstool, whispers in my ear, "I am hardly one of these, dear grandfather, although I love them dearly. They are very kind to me, but you will be kinder still, I know." I have my hand upon his neck, and stoop to kiss him, when my clock strikes, my chair is in its old spot, and I am alone. What if I be? What if this fireside be tenantless, save for the presence of one weak old man? From my housetop I can look upon 100 homes, in every one of which these social companions are matters of reality. In my daily walks I pass 1,000 men whose cares are all forgotten, whose labours are made light, whose dull routine of work from day to day is cheered and brightened by their glimpses of domestic joy at home. Amid the struggles of this struggling town, what cheerful sacrifices are made, what toil endured with readiness, what patience showed and fortitude displayed for the mere sake of home and its affections! Let me thank Heaven that I can people my fireside with shadows such as these, with shadows of bright objects that exist in crowds about me, and let me say, I am alone no more. I never was less so. I write it with a grateful heart, than I am to-night. Recollections of the past and visions of the present come to bear me company, the meanest man to whom I have ever given alms appears, to add his mite of peace and comfort to my stock, and whenever the fire within me shall grow cold, to light my path upon this earth no more. I pray that it may be at such an hour as this, and when I love the world as well as I do now. The deaf gentleman from his own apartment. Our dear friend laid down his pen at the end of the foregoing paragraph to take it up no more. I little thought ever to employ mine upon so sorrowful a task as that which he has left me, and to which I now devote it. As he did not appear among us at his usual hour next morning, we knocked gently at his door. No answer being given, it was softly opened, and then to our surprise we saw him seated before the ashes of his fire, with a little table I was accustomed to set at his elbow when I left him for the night at a short distance from him, as though he had pushed it away with the idea of rising and retiring to his bed. His crutch and footstool lay at his feet as usual, and he was dressed in his chamber gown, which he had put on before I left him. He was reclining in his chair, in his accustomed posture, with his face towards the fire, and seemed absorbed in meditation. Indeed, at first we almost hoped he was. Going up to him, we found him dead. I have often, very often, seen him sleeping, and always peacefully, but I never saw him look so calm and tranquil. His face wore a serene, benign expression, which had impressed me very strongly when we last shook hands. Not that he had ever had any other look, God knows, but there was something in this so very spiritual, so strangely and undefinably allied to youth, although his head was grey and venerable, that it was new even in him. It came upon me all at once, when on some slight pretence he called me back upon the previous night to take me by the hand again, and once more say, God bless you. A bell-rope hung within his reach, but he had not moved towards it, nor had he stirred, we all agreed, except, as I have said, to push away his table, which he could have done, and no doubt did, with a very slight motion of his hand. He had relapsed for a moment into his late train of meditation, and with a thoughtful smile upon his face, had died. I had long known it to be his wish that whenever this event should come to pass we might be all assembled in the house. I therefore lost no time in sending for Mr. Pickwick and for Mr. Miles, both of whom arrived before the messenger's return. It is not my purpose to dilate upon the sorrow and affectionate emotions of which I was at once the witness and the sharer, but I may say, of the humbler mourners, that his faithful housekeeper was fairly heartbroken, that the poor barber would not be comforted, and that I shall respect the homely truth and warmth of heart of Mr. Weller and his son, to the last moment of my life. "And this sweet old creetur, sir," said the elder Mr. Weller to me in the afternoon, "has bolted. Him as had no woice, and was so free from temper that an infant might ha' drove him, has been took at last with that 'ere unawoidable fit o' staggers as we must all come to, and gone off his feed for ever. I see him," said the old gentleman, with a moisture in his eye which could not be mistaken, "I see him getting every journey more and more groggy. I says to Samivel, my boy, the grey's a going at the knees. And now my predilections is fatally werrified, and him as I could never do enough to serve or show my liking for, is up the great uniwersal spout o' natur." I was not the less sensible of the old man's attachment because he expressed it in his peculiar manner. Indeed, I can truly assert of both him and his son, that notwithstanding the extraordinary dialogues they held together, and the strange commentaries and corrections with which each of them illustrated the other's speech, I do not think it possible to exceed the sincerity of their regret, and that I am sure their thoughtfulness and anxiety in anticipating the discharge of many little offices of sympathy would have done honour to the most delicate-minded persons. Our friend had frequently told us that his will would be found in a box in the clock case, the key of which was in his writing desk. As he had told us also that he desired it to be opened immediately after his death, whenever that should happen, we met together that night for the fulfilment of his request. We found it where he had told us, wrapped in a sealed paper, and with it a codicil of recent date, in which he named Mr. Miles and Mr. Pickwick his executors, as having no need of any greater benefit from his estate than a generous token, which he bequeathed to them, of his friendship and remembrance. After pointing out the spot in which he wished his ashes to repose, he gave to his dear old friends, Jack Redburn and myself, his house, his books, his furniture, in short, all that his house contained, and with this legacy more ample means of maintaining it in its present state than we, with our habits and at our terms of life, can ever exhaust. Besides these gifts, he left to us in trust an annual sum of no insignificant amount, to be distributed in charity among his accustomed pensioners. They are a long list, and such other claimants on his bounty as might from time to time present themselves. And as true charity not only covers a multitude of sins, but includes a multitude of virtues, such as forgiveness, liberal construction, gentleness and mercy to the faults of others, and the remembrance of our own imperfections and advantages, he bade us not inquire too closely into the venial errors of the poor, but finding that they were poor, first to relieve and then endeavour, at an advantage, to reclaim them. To the housekeeper he left an annuity, sufficient for her comfortable maintenance and support through life. For the barber, who had attended him many years, he made a similar provision. And I may make two remarks in this place. First, that I think this pair are very likely to club their means together and make a match of it; and secondly, that I think my friend had this result in his mind, for I have heard him say more than once that he could not concur with the generality of mankind in censuring equal measures made in later life, since there were many cases in which such unions could not fail to be a wise and rational source of happiness to both parties. The elder Mr. Weller is so far from viewing this prospect with any feelings of jealousy, that he appears to be very much relieved by its contemplation, and his son, if I am not mistaken, participates in this feeling. We are all of opinion, however, that the old gentleman's danger, even at its crisis, was very slight, and that he merely laboured under one of those transitory weaknesses to which persons of his temperament are now and then liable, and which become less and less alarming at every return, until they wholly subside. I have no doubt he will remain a jolly old widower for the rest of his life, as he has already inquired of me with much gravity whether a writ of habeas corpus would enable him to settle his property upon Tony beyond the possibility of recall, and has in my presence conjured his son, with tears in his eyes, that in the event of his ever becoming amorous again, he will put him in a strait waistcoat until the fit is past, and distinctly inform the lady that his property is made over. Although I have very little doubt that Sam would dutifully comply with these injunctions in a case of extreme necessity, and that he would do so with perfect composure and coolness, I do not apprehend things will ever come to that pass, as the old gentleman seems perfectly happy in the society of his son, his pretty daughter-in-law, and his grandchildren, and has solemnly announced his determination to take arter the old 'un in all respects. From which I infer that it is his intention to regulate his conduct by the model of Mr. Pickwick, who will certainly set him the example of a single life. I have diverged for a moment from the subject with which I set out, for I know that my friend was interested in these little matters, and I have a natural tendency to linger upon any topic that occupied his thoughts or gave him pleasure and amusement. His remaining wishes are very briefly told. He desired that we would make him the frequent subject of our conversation; at the same time, that we would never speak of him with an air of gloom or restraint, but frankly, as one whom we still loved and hoped to meet again. He trusted that the old house would wear no aspect of mourning, but that it would be lively and cheerful, and that we would not remove or cover up his picture, which hangs in our dining room, but make it our companion as he had been. His own room, our place of meeting, remains at his desire in its accustomed state; our seats are placed about the table as of old; his easy chair, his desk, his crutch, his footstool, hold their accustomed places, and the clock stands in its familiar corner. We go into the chamber at stated times to see that all is as it should be, and to take care that the light and air are not shut out, for on that point he expressed a strong solicitude. But it was his fancy that the apartment should not be inhabited, that it should be religiously preserved in this condition, and that the voice of his old companion should be heard no more. My own history may be summed up in very few words, and even those I should have spared the reader but for my friend's allusion to me some time since. I have no deeper sorrow than the loss of a child, an only daughter, who is living and who fled from her father's house but a few weeks before our friend and I first met. I had never spoken of this even to him, because I have always loved her, and could not bear to tell him of her error until I could tell him also of her sorrow and regret. Happily I was enabled to do so some time ago, and it will not be long, with Heaven's leave, before she is restored to me, before I find in her and her husband the support of my declining years. For my pipe, it is an old relic of home, a thing of no great worth, a poor trifle, but sacred to me for her sake. Thus, since the death of our venerable friend, Jack Redburn and I have been the sole tenants of the old house, and day by day have lounged together in his favourite walks. Mindful of his injunctions, we have long been able to speak of him with ease and cheerfulness, and to remember him as he would be remembered. From certain allusions which Jack has dropped to his having been deserted and cast off in early life, I am inclined to believe that some passages of his youth may possibly be shadowed out in the history of Mr Chester and his son, but seeing that he avoids the subject, I have not pursued it. My task is done. The chamber in which we have whiled away so many hours, not, I hope, without some pleasure and some profit, is deserted. Our happy hour of meeting strikes no more. The chimney corner has grown cold, and Master Humphrey's clock has stopped for ever. End of section 9. Master Humphrey's Clock, Section 10. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reading by Brad Philippone. Master Humphrey's Clock, by Charles Dickens. To the Readers of Master Humphrey's Clock. Dear Friends, next November we shall have finished the tale of which we are at present engaged, and shall have travelled together through 20 monthly parts and 87 weekly numbers. It is my design when we have gone so far to close this work. Let me tell you why. I should not regard the anxiety, the close confinement, or the constant attention inseparable from the weekly form of publication, for to commune with you in any form is to me a labour of love, if I had found it advantageous to the conduct of my stories, the elucidation of my meaning, or the gradual development of my characters. But I have not done so. I have often felt cramped and confined in a very irksome and harassing degree by the space in which I have been constrained to move. I have wanted you to know more at once than I could tell you, and it has frequently been of the greatest importance to my cherished intention that you should do so. I have been sometimes strongly tempted, and have been at some pains to resist the temptation, to hurry incidents on, lest they should appear to you who waited from week to week and had not, like me, the result and purpose in your minds, too long delayed. In a word, I have found this form of publication most anxious, perplexing, and difficult. I cannot bear these jerky confidences which are no sooner begun than ended, and no sooner ended than begun again. Many passages in a tale of any length depend materially for their interest on the intimate relation they bear to what has gone before, or to what is to follow. I have sometimes found it difficult, when I issue 32 closely printed pages once a month, to sustain in your minds this needful connection. In the present form of publication it is often, especially in the first half of a story, quite impossible to preserve it sufficiently through the current numbers. And although, in my progress, I am gradually able to set you right, and to show you what my meaning has been, and to work it out, I see no reason why you should ever be wrong when I have it in my power, by resorting to a better means of communication between us, to prevent it. Considerations of immediate profit and advantage ought, in such a case, to be of secondary importance. They would lead me, at all hazards, to hold my present course. but for the reason I have just now mentioned, I have, after long consideration, and with especial reference to the next new tale I bear in my mind, arrived at the conclusion that it will be better to abandon this scheme of publication in favour of our old and well tried plan, which has only 12 gaps in a year instead of 52. Therefore my intention is to close this story, with the limits of which I am of course by this time acquainted, and this work within or about the period I have mentioned. I should add that for the general convenience of subscribers, another volume of collected numbers will not be published until the whole is brought to a conclusion. Taking advantage of the respite which the close of this work will afford me, I have decided in January next to pay a visit to America. The pleasure I anticipate from this realization of a wish I have long entertained, and long hoped to gratify, is subdued by the reflection that it must separate us for a longer time than other circumstances would have rendered necessary. On the 1st of November, 1842, I purpose, if it please God, to commence my book in monthly parts, under the old green cover, in the old size and form, and at the old price. I look forward to addressing a few more words to you in reference to this latter theme before I close the task on which I am now engaged. If there be any among the numerous readers of Master Humphrey's Clock who are at first dissatisfied with the prospect of this change, and it is not unnatural almost to hope that there may be some, I trust they will, at no very distant day, find reason to agree with its author. September, 1841. Postscript. Now that the time is come for taking leave, I find that the words I have to add are very few indeed. We part until next November. It is a long parting between us, but if I have left you anything by which to remember me, in the meantime, with no unkind or distant feelings, anything by which I may be associated in spirit with your firesides, homes, and blameless pleasures, I am happy. Believe me, it has ever been my true desire to add to the common stock of healthful cheerfulness, good humour, and good will; and trust me, when I return to England and to another tale of English life and manners, I shall not slacken in this zealous work. I take the opportunity for thanking all those who have addressed me by letter since the appearance of the foregoing announcement, and of expressing a hope that they will rest contented with this form of acknowledgment, as their number renders it impossible to me to answer them individually. I bid farewell to them, and all my readers, with a regret that we feel in taking leave of friends who have become endeared to us by long and close communication, and I look forward with truthfulness and pleasure to our next meeting. November, 1841. End of Section 10. End of Master Humphrey's Clock.